Good morning. Man, you guys are so obedient. It's like everyone's in their seat and calm down. I think there's some anticipation here. My name is Richard Charis. It's my fan. I'm the coordinator of the Practical Government School in the third year here at Charis. And I think this might be my first time this year in front of first years. So, hey, first years, how are you guys doing? Welcome. Do y'all like the snow? Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it? Beautiful, huh? Finally feels like winter in Woodland Park. You guys, it's an honor and a privilege for me this morning to introduce your guest speaker today. Your guest speaker this morning is Tim Barton. Tim is the son of David Barton, and David is the founder of Wall Builders Ministry. How many of you have ever heard of Wall Builders? Awesome. Wall Builders is a national pro-family organization that represents America's forgotten heroes and history with an emphasis on our religious, moral, and constitutional heritage. You know, over the last couple of years in the Practical Government School, it's been just an incredible honor, privilege, and pleasure to get to know both David and Tim. And you guys are in for a real treat here. Now, Tim is... He's got a college degree in business management, I think, but his real claim to fame is he's like a basketball player par excellence. Has coached camp at Duke University of all places. I mean, they're almost as good as Oklahoma State in basketball, I think, right? Yeah. So, but you guys, without further ado, I want you to buckle up, get your notebooks out, be ready to take some notes because this is going to blow your minds. Please make Tim Barton feel welcome this morning.
Thanks, Richard. Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning, and we're going to talk a little bit, as Richard mentioned, Wall Builders does a lot with American history, and as you look at America, this is something that is near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of work with the next generation, with a lot of millennials, with a lot of Gen Z, who are your kind of up and coming, whether it's high school, then now they're freshmen in college. But one of the things that's interesting about the next generation is we're growing up in a culture where we hear how bad America is. And if you lived in America for a few years, you've probably heard some negative things about this nation, which is a little ironic, especially if you've ever been on a mission trip to a third world nation. You realize that this place with all these problems is actually a pretty good place. But when you start looking at our nation, and when you see what the founding fathers did to really establish our nation, when you go back to the original documents, that the ideas, the philosophies they set forward, they made America a very unique nation, not just in concept, but in practice. In fact, if you want to get an idea of how unique our nation is, you can look at the UN. And I don't always recommend looking at the UN because usually it's nonsense. But there's 195 member nations that were present this last year. And of the 195 member nations, America is one of the only nations present that doesn't average a revolution every 30 to 40 years. Now, here's what's interesting is we don't recognize how blessed we are living in America because we take things for granted. That's normal for us to have stability. It's normal for us to not have civil war and revolution. But you know, if you live over in the Middle East or Europe, it's not normal to have stability. That's very unusual, and this is where when you start looking at our nation, you know, in our entire existence as a nation, we've only had one constitution. If you look at the rest of the world, they haven't lived that way. In fact, you start thinking about some of these nations over in Europe, some of these nations around the world, nobody has enjoyed the stability we've enjoyed. Russia, it's considered a powerhouse today. Russia's had 4 different constitutions in the last 80 years. Or you can take somewhere like South Korea. They're one of the top 10 economic producers in the world today. And even South Korea has had 6 constitutions over the last 70 years. This is interesting when you start looking at the rest of the world because you realize, you know, it's kind of special what we have in America. And by the way, looking at this idea of constitutions, the length of the average world constitution is only 17 years. So just so you understand that you live in a nation that has unprecedented stability, yeah, you really do when every 17 years the rest of the world is going through a new constitution or a new form of government. This is kind of unique, and it's not just stability that we enjoy in America. We actually are a very creative people, and I don't know if you've ever woken up in the morning and looked in the mirror and thought, wow, I am so creative. I've never done that. My wife, super creative, not me. But this is as a whole, as a people. As an American people, we are a very creative people. Now, how can we say that? Well, we only have 4% of the world's population, and saying that our 4% is very creative, well, that could be subjective, right? How can you measure that? Well, you can measure it through inventions and technological discoveries and breakthroughs and medical discoveries and breakthroughs. You can measure it through patents. You can measure it through writings. When you start looking, whatever measurement tool you want to use, what's amazing is our 4% outproduces the rest of the 96% of the world combined. Now, we think of China or Japan or some of these places as being really technological savvy. These guys, you take Russia and China and Japan, whatever these major nations do you think exist, add them together and they still don't produce as much as our 4% does. That's really amazing to think about. And we can go beyond creativity. We could talk about even finances, which we're all believing for more of those. But as we look at finances, with our 4% of the world's population, we account for 25% of the world's GDP. And a lot of people say, well, yeah, but America, you guys have more natural resources, you have better land. Do you know America is not in the top 10 of the nations with natural resources? We're not even in the top 60 of farmable land of the nations of the world. But do you know the farmers in America produce enough every single year to feed every individual in the world? Well, that's rather remarkable. And that's 1%, by the way, of our GDP. That's 1% of what we do of our economy. This is really kind of interesting when you start looking and measuring our nation. We really are a special nation. Now, as I'm saying this, one of the things that was said about our nation back up to 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville was a French philosopher and writer. He came to America, and he's the one that wrote the book called Democracy in America. And it was in his book that he said America is really exceptional. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, today some people know that name, but really we attribute him to this author or this political writer kind of guy. Well, at the time, he was none of those things. He was actually over in France working for their prison system. And he was assigned to come to America, and they said, we want you to go and see what's different in America, but specifically what's different, because in France, they looked at our prison system in America, and they said, you know, the Americans, they don't have the problems we have over here in France. Now, if you're not familiar with France, France had some issues, and so the way they had to deal with people was a little more difficult. Well, in France, they executed 40,000 people with the guillotine, and so they're looking at America going, you know, in America, they don't have the same problems trying to control people, trying to lead their people. So they said, we want de Tocqueville to go over to America and see what they do. Now, he's supposed to inspect for the prison system idea, see what they do that helps them not have all the trouble we have over here. So he comes to America and begins to investigate. Now, let me just also back up and give you a little context. Knowing that he's coming to America, knowing that the French think America looks very different, let me just give you a little perspective on this. James Kent's known as the father of American jurisprudence. He's one of the three guys most responsible for establishing the court system in America. He served on the New York Supreme Court. And serving on the New York Supreme Court, and by the way, at the time, New York, largest state, so this is a big deal. He's serving on their Supreme Court. But while he served there, he personally oversaw 1,755 cases. He personally wrote that he was a little nervous for New York because there was a crime wave that was sweeping New York. Now, we're talking the entire state. There's a crime wave sweeping the state. Now, if you watch the news and somebody this weekend says there's a crime wave sweeping Chicago, I don't know how they would tell it's a crime wave sweeping because I think it's like what they live in. I don't know. But Chicago, they have anywhere from 20 to 40 murders over any given weekend, and that's one weekend. So, and this is one city. So they're saying we've got this crime wave. Well, James Kent says we have a crime wave sweeping New York. Now, just again for perspective, in his 16 years serving on the state Supreme Court, guess how many murder trials he had to deal with? Well, his murder trials included 8 cases. And he wrote that there was a crime wave. When you have a murder every other year, that's not a crime wave. But this is what France looked at. And France said, okay, what's happening in America, we want that kind of problem over here in France. Alexis, go to America, figure out what they're doing. Now, when Alexis came to America, he actually In his book, Democracy in America, he actually wrote that one of the things that was so unique about the Americans was their Christian faith. It was their church attendance and the way they committed to family and education. And so he goes through this whole list that really was the reason we had a very stable society. But it was from his book that we get this idea that America is an exceptional nation, at least the phrase of it. And here's what he said in this. He said, the position of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. He says, what the Americans are enjoying is so unusual, probably nobody else will ever get to enjoy what the Americans enjoy. Now, this is a very unique assessment from a foreigner who comes to America and says, look, I've seen the way we do it over in Europe, and it's so different here. Well, this is where we get this phrase, American exceptionalism. And as I'm saying this is one of those phrases that if you say to a college professor today, if you said in many high schools today, if you said to a millennial today, they would say, no, America's not exceptional. You can't say America's exceptional. Well, in fact, I had a debate with a professor just recently, and a professor from Arizona, he said, you can't say America's exceptional because America's done more bad than we've ever done good. I said, really? I said, well, let's have a conversation. I said, what are all the bad things America's done? He said, well, slavery. In fact, we didn't give women's rights to the 1900s. I said, okay, that's interesting. Let's just talk about the first one. Let's talk about slavery. You're saying America's bad, and the standard you're using as a measurement is slavery. I said, let me ask this. What nation in their entire existence never had slaves? Yeah, he couldn't give me an answer either. Because there is none. Because slavery was a condition of humanity. It was not a uniquely American problem. I said, but let me ask this question. In what nation did white people fight white people to free all the black people? Because it happened once here in America. I said, now, if let's just agree, like your standard is slavery says something's wrong, well, then every nation in the history of the world is an evil nation. However, I would still contend that America is one of the best because we fought a war to end slavery. Right? So even if we are a bad nation, we're one of the best of the bad nations. I said, but let's take women's rights. I said, where do women enjoy more rights than they have in America today? He said, well, I'm not talking about today. I said, no, I know you're not. But where do women have more rights than in America today? He said, nowhere. I said, what nation gave women those rights before they got them in America? And he couldn't name a nation. I said, see, here's your problem. You are judging America by a standard that you're not judging every other nation to. If we judged on an equal standard, every nation has the same standard, you would discover America is a pretty special nation. Now, we are certainly not a perfect nation, and I'll be very quick to acknowledge this. There's a lot of problems in our nation right now I wish we could see remedied. We can go down the list, whether it's abortion, whether it's marriage, whether it's the fact we're confused about bathrooms and genders. There's a lot of things I wish we could solve real fast. And growing up in the country, those are pretty easy solutions. It's not complicated. We have a ranch and a farm. There's animals. You can figure it out. But there's no doubt our nation has problems. But I would also contend every nation for the rest of eternity will have problems. And they'll have problems for one reason. Because they're full of people. There was a reason Jesus had to come. And that doesn't make America a bad nation. It makes America a nation that needs Jesus, just like every other nation. Let me give you one last thought on this before we get into a little more faith elements for our nation. One of the reasons that people don't recognize, especially for younger generation, for millennials, for Gen Zers, they don't recognize how America's special because they've never been out of the nation. I know some of you just got back from missions trips, which is awesome. I love doing missions trips. I've led many in my life. And if you've ever gone on a missions trip, what you will discover is the rest of the world doesn't live like we live in America. In fact, for half the world, according to the World Poverty Center, the World Poverty Bank, they live on $2 a day or less. For 1/4 of the world, roughly 1.9 billion people, they live on less than $1.25 a day. So the number one health crisis around the rest of the world is malnutrition. Now, if you come to America and we said, what is the number one health crisis for poor people in America? Do you know it's not malnutrition? Right, what is it? It's obesity. Now, I just want to point something out. I'm not trying to be rude or crass or crude. I just want to point something out. The rest of the world is trying to get clean drinking water. The rest of the world is trying to overcome sickness and disease. The rest of the world is trying to get enough food just to stay alive. And the biggest health problem you have if you live in poverty in America is you have too much McDonald's. Understand the nature of that problem. I would always rather have a problem where I have too much of something than when I have nothing. And this is the problem if you live in America. And this is where our nation is a very unique nation, even in the sense of our problems. And in fact, if we started looking at the rest of the nations, if you take a topic like natural disasters, every single year around the world, natural disasters happen, whether we just had Hurricane Harvey recently down in Texas, but there's mudslides, and there's tsunamis, and there's hurricanes, and there's all kinds of things that happen every year around the world. And you know, in the world, there's lots of different kinds of nations of the world, all different kinds of makeups. You have Christian nations and Muslim, and you have Buddhist and secular and Hindu. There's all kinds of nations. You know, it's interesting when a natural disaster happens, it's interesting to see who responds in this time of crisis. If you back up to the mid-2000s in Indonesia, it's a Muslim nation. They were devastated by a tsunami, destroyed their nation. Now, Indonesia is a Muslim nation, surrounded by other Muslim nations. So when they were devastated, logically, if they're a Muslim nation, who should be the nations helping them out? They're Muslim brothers. But do you know there was not a single Muslim nation that sent aid, effort, or relief? In fact, no Hindu, no Buddhist, no secular. It was only the Christian nations that sent effort and relief. In fact, America sent more aid, effort, and relief than every other nation combined. And do you know this is actually normal practice for us in America? When the tsunami hit Japan just a couple years ago, America sends more aid, effort, and relief than every other nation combined. This is what we do. In fact, if you think about our nation, think about how many organizations are set up designed just to help people in times of need. We have organizations where you can sponsor a family in a third world nation. You can get them a chicken to lay eggs. You can get them a milk and goat. You can get them a milk and cow, things that will provide sustenance for their family to survive. We have organizations in America like World Vision, where you can sponsor a kid in a third world nation $40 a month, and they get food, they get an education. Do you know China doesn't do World Vision? Russia doesn't do World Vision. Other leading nations of the world, they don't do the same thing to help people in need. We do it in America. And the reason, very simply, is because we take from what God has given and we want to help people in need. Tom's is a shoe company. They said, hey, if you'll buy a pair of our shoes, we'll take a matching pair. We'll put it on the feet of a kid in a third world nation that doesn't have shoes. I mean, this is just kind of what we do. Well, this is a uniquely American concept and idea, at least in practice. And it's because we recognize that we have been blessed. And in this blessing that we have, we say, who can we help? We want to help people in need. And this is why, do you know, for most of the world, they don't look at America and see this really wicked, evil place. For most of the world, they look at America and they go, I really wish I could get into America. That would be a great place to go. That's the reason we have an immigration problem. Do you know China doesn't have an immigration problem? Right? I mean, let's be honest. A good measurement of a nation is who wants to get in and who wants to get out. When you have more people that want to get in than want to get out, you got to be doing something right. And this is what, again, our nation is pretty unique, but this is going to go back to saying our nation's exceptional. Now, that doesn't mean our nation's perfect. It doesn't mean we don't have problems that we need to remedy. Absolutely we do. But our nation is a special nation, and the question ought to be why. Why is our nation different? And this is really what I want to get into with us this morning, is why is our nation different? Well, what we used to know for a long time, in fact, with us doing a lot of history at Wall Builders, one of the things we do is we will point to a lot of old historical documents. And you know what's interesting is if you go back to the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s in early America, do you know one thing that is a very common thread that you see taught, that you see promoted, that you see people bragging about and defending? One thing that you really see kind of at the foundation of why America was different is the Bible. Now, if you look at America today, you would not necessarily see the Bible as being what has made us a different nation, because we really don't do a very good job following biblical principles anymore, and that's even Christians for a lot of them, right? We just don't do a good job, but let me just give you some examples. So if we took something as simple as our English language, do you know our English language has been shaped by the Bible? In fact, we have more than 250 idioms that come directly from the Bible that are part of our everyday vocabulary. Now, I know Andrew likes to have you guys read the King James, so you'll probably recognize some of these. But by the skin of your teeth, well, here's my 2 cents. You know, a leopard can't change his spots. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. These are signs of the times. Well, that's a thorn in the flesh. From the cradle to the grave. Well, that's handwriting on the wall. Well, that's a fly in the ointment. We could even come updated a little bit, right? Eye for an eye. Well, a house divided against itself can't stand. Well, we need to fight the good fight. Well, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. No rest for the wicked. Let there be light. My cup runneth over. Go the extra mile. The promised land. Now, I don't know if anybody watches any sports at all in this room, but this is a list taken just from ESPN. In fact, everybody in New England is praying that Tom Brady leads them into the promised land. And then all the other Christians are praying the other way. Here's what's amazing about this. There's 257, and they're phrases that we recognize, but most Americans have no idea they come from the Bible. And by the way, if you want to have a fun, just little challenge, start paying attention to people's conversations and listen for when they quote the Bible, not intending to quote the Bible, such as these kinds of things. In fact, if you go to Walmart just down the hill and you're checking out at Walmart, just listen to people at checkout. And when someone says something that you recognize that's a Bible verse, you ought to just jump in and say, hey, did you know you quoted the Bible? Now, I mean, it's probably weird, and they're going to think it's odd, right? But it could be a good witnessing opportunity, right? Let's talk about the Bible, talk about Jesus. But they'll probably say, I didn't quote the Bible, and actually, no, you did. And they'll say, oh, yeah? Well, then what did I quote? And then you actually have to have an idea of what they quoted. So you might want to study a little bit for this. But here's what's amazing. The Bible literally has shaped so much of our nation, and this is evident just through our English language, but I can give you a whole lot of other lists. But this is where today, most Christians don't recognize even the Bible very well. We've become a pretty biblically illiterate society, and that was very different from early America. In fact, if you back up, the son of John Adams was John Quincy Adams. He grew up during the Revolution, goes on to become the 6th president of the United States. But here's what he said about the Bible. He said, with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it is not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. Now you think about that. He said, it's not impressive if somebody knows the Bible. Why would he think that was not impressive? Because that made you just like everybody else. He said, however, if someone doesn't know the Bible, that's embarrassing, right? But I want you to think about this. How could you, in America, consider yourself an educated person if you're not familiar with the greatest literary work that's ever been written? How can you be an educated person? Well, this is their view. They thought you... Now, today, that's very much the opposite here in America, where if we find someone that knows the Bible, we go, oh my gosh, they know the Bible so well. But, you know, in America, you don't have to feel bad about not knowing the Bible anymore, because now you fit in with everybody else. This is where culture has shifted, even in our Bible understanding, our Bible knowledge, our appreciation for the Word of God. And I mentioned, see, this is John Quincy Adams, the son of John Abigail Adams. And if we were to ask the question, where did he get this veneration, this appreciation for the Word of God? Well, this is where you have a little fun backstory. Because you have to back up to mom and dad, because where do kids learn to appreciate the Bible? Well, mom and dad are teaching them to appreciate the Bible. Well, if you remember during the Revolution, John Adams is very involved. In fact, he ends up having to go to Europe quite often to try to negotiate an end to the war, negotiate with other countries and do things. And so as John's gone a lot, Abigail becomes pretty much my favorite female from the founding era. This woman is unreal because she has to take care and control, run the family farm, do all the business, raise the family. I mean, you talk about, like, this is the original Wonder Woman, right? Like, this girl was amazing. She's running and doing. But you know, the one thing that she always made sure every Sunday that her family did is every Sunday they would go to church. In fact, the church where they go, outside that church to this day, there's a statue, and it's a statue of Abigail leading John Quincy Adams to church, because this is what she was known for. And you know, hey, mom, dad's overseas. Doesn't matter, we're going to church, right? There's no excuse. And so every single day they go to church. Well, John Quincy Adams grows up in this environment where they're prioritizing faith, prioritizing Christianity, prioritizing the Word of God. So he grows up in this environment. As he's growing up in this, one of the other cool things about his life is when he was 8 years old, John Adams used to have the Massachusetts Minutemen. They would come and they would do their musket drills in front of his house. So as an 8-year-old boy, John Quincy Adams got to take his little musket and go and perform musket drills with the Minutemen. Now, that's every little boy's dream, right? I had a little bolt-action .22. I would have signed up like instantly. That would have been the coolest thing. Well, he gets to do this as an 8-year-old. As an 11-year-old, he gets to join his dad on one of these trips, and so he's going over to Europe. Well, when he gets over to Europe, apparently he was supposed to write his mom and let her know that, hey, I'm okay, I'm alive. Apparently he forgot to write her, or like the letter got lost, because there's no record of him writing, but there is record of his mom writing him. And as she writes this letter, she starts off with a little chastisement that you were supposed to let me know you're okay. I'm trusting God that you are, but you better let me know. So she's kind of letting him know you need to write. But as she gets into this letter, I want to read you just part of what she's telling her 11-year-old son over in Europe. Now, Europe is not known at this point for being the bastion of Christianity. It's known for really being very secular and very liberal in their thinking of rejecting God. And so she's writing him about this. But here's what she told her 11-year-old son. Adhere to those religious sentiments and principles which were early instilled into your mind. And remember, you are accountable to your Maker for all your words and actions. Now, let me just pause for a second, because what she just pulled was the God is watching you, right? I know I'm not there, but God's still watching you. That's what she just told him, okay? But then check out what she tells him next. This is amazing. Dear as you are to me, I had much rather you should find your grave in the ocean, or an untimely death crop you in your infant years, rather than see you an immoral, wicked, or a graceless child. I've never gotten a love note like that from my mom. I hope you drown in the ocean. Good luck. Enjoy your trip. But think about what she's actually emphasizing. She's saying it's actually better that you die before you have a chance to reject your faith, rather than you live a long life having rejected the God we believe in. What an amazing thought. And by the way, back up to Proverbs 22:6 tells us that you train up a child in the way they should go. When they're old, they won't depart from it. What kind of training is she doing right now? She is training the emphasis of the eternal, right? Son, remember, not only is God watching, but it's better that you don't live a long life, but you have eternity in heaven, as opposed to you living a long life and rejecting all. I mean, this is really kind of amazing training. Well, so John Quincy Adams is growing up with this. Well, at that same year, at 11, he received a congressional appointment to be the official secretary to the diplomatic committee going over to Paris to negotiate an end to the war. Now, this is an 11-year-old who has been assigned the job of secretary for the delegation going over. I don't know the last time you looked at an 11-year-old's handwriting. He's the secretary, which means he's taking all the notes. That's an amazing job for an 11-year-old. Well, his career of amazing continued, because when he was 14, he received another congressional appointment to go before the throne of Catherine the Great in Russia. And this time, as a 14-year-old, part of the reason he got the job was he was going to be the interpreter, and he could do that because he was already fluent in 6 languages as a 14-year-old. Now, I mean, probably once he grows up, he'll be really impressive, but, it's not bad for a 14-year-old. That's a pretty good start. Well, this is him growing up. Now, at the end of the revolution, when we finally read the Constitution, we have our first president. Under George Washington, he becomes America's top diplomat. In fact, George Washington says he's the best diplomat America ever had. He then is a diplomat under his father, John Adams. Oh, let me back up. I forgot. So while he's a diplomat under George Washington, he's overseas. Well, his wife and his family are back here in America because they weren't making these trips with him. And so as he's overseas, he wrote a series of 9 letters to his son, who was 10 years old at the time, And he wrote his son, he said, I'm concerned that you're not getting the instruction that you should from a father, and so I want to give you the instruction you need. Well, all 9 letters were about how to study the Bible, but actually, it included an Old Testament survey and a New Testament survey in the midst of the letter. Because he starts off explaining in Genesis, this is what happens. And when Moses is writing, here's what he's writing. And he goes through, and so really, in 9 letters, he gives his son a Bible course, Old Testament survey, New Testament survey. But in the midst of it, he's telling his son what he really needs to know. Now, this is a 10-year-old boy he's writing to. And let me just read you part of what he wrote his 10-year-old son. Here's what he said. No book in the world deserves to be so unceasingly studied and so profoundly meditated upon as the Bible. I have myself for many years made it a practice to read through the Bible once every year. Now, he's telling his 10-year-old son, I read the Bible at least once a year, which I know is a great practice up here at Charis. You guys are working to do that every year, go through the Bible. It's awesome. Every Christian ought to do that. Every American ought to do that. But he's telling his 10-year-old son, this is what I do. Now, here's what he tells his son as he reads through the Bible. He says, my custom is to read 4 or 5 chapters every morning immediately after rising from my bed, and employs about an hour of my time, and seems to me the most suitable manner of beginning the day. Now, not only is he telling his son, I read the Bible every morning, he actually goes a step further because he tells his son, I spend an hour reading 4 or 5 chapters. Now, with people who are familiar with the Bible, it should not take you an hour to read 4 or 5 chapters. So was he like a slacker? What's his problem? Well, he actually read in 4 languages every morning. And then he compared the Russian and the French and the English. He would compare them all back to the original Septuagint, the Greek, to make sure they had done a good translation. And in his journal, he says, you know, I think the Russians really did a better job with this verse, but the French really nailed this verse. So his journal, he's writing about not only reading in 4 languages, but then comparing it back to the Greek to make sure they did a good translation. Okay. Like that shames my Bible study, right? Like I've got a study Bible and I read some commentary, but I don't, oh my gosh. And he's telling his 10-year-old son, this is what I do every morning. Well, he continues. He says, I've always endeavored to read it with the same spirit which I now recommend to you, that is, with the intention and desire that it may contribute to my advance in wisdom and virtue. Now, he's telling his 10-year-old son, the reason we do this is to increase wisdom and virtue. Wisdom deals with the way we think, and virtue deals with the way we live. He's telling his son, we need to read the Bible every morning to make sure we're thinking the right thoughts and to make sure we're living the life God wants us to live. That's amazing, because that's a little more than just a spiritual devotional in the morning. No. I want to make sure I have the mind of Christ and make sure I'm living everything God's called me to do in my life. That's an amazing thought. Well, this is what he's telling his 10-year-old son. Well, at the end of Washington's presidency, his dad becomes president. He's a diplomat under his father. Then under Jefferson, he becomes a U.S. senator. Then under Madison, he again becomes a diplomat. Under Monroe, he becomes a secretary of state. Then he becomes the 6th president of the United States of America. And he's the only president who, at the end of his presidency, says, you know, there's something I really want to do. And so he's the only president to go from being president, and he actually goes back and he serves in Congress. Now, some presidents have become a congressman and then gone on to the presidency, but nobody's been president and gone back to Congress. That's like being a starter on varsity and then going to JV. Like that's weird. You wouldn't want to do that. But he did, and he says, there's a great evil in America that must be remedied. He says that is the evil of slavery. So he says, I'm going back to Congress so that we can abolish slavery in America. He becomes the leader of the anti-slavery movement in Congress, a very loud and vocal voice. In the midst of him doing this, well as he's fighting against slavery for years, he's involved in a lot of significant things. In fact, he's the guy in the midst of fighting against slavery. He does the Amistad decision, which I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Amistad. It's a very interesting movie, but there were free blacks who were illegally kidnapped and captured. They were sold into the slave trade. They were brought to America. He argues the case before the U.S. Supreme Court. At the time, of the 9 justices, I think there were 7 of them that had slaves. As he's arguing for the freedom of these illegally imprisoned slaves, he's arguing before a pro-slavery U.S. Supreme Court. Well, not only does he win this case, at the end of the case, his case lasted for 3 days. In the midst of those 3 days, one of the 9 justices died. They had to call a recess, timeout. They had to go bury the judge, come back and finish the case. As they come back, he finishes the case. when he finishes, he tells the judges, he says, I'm done with my case, but there's something else I would like to say. And the U.S. Supreme Court Justice said, well, we'll speak on, Mr. Adams. He says, well, it strikes me that death is inevitable and certain for all of us. He says, as I, a very old man, I will soon die, as one of your own number has already died. He said, it would behoove us to examine our life and prepare ourselves that when we do die, we would be ready to hear, well done, good and faithful, enter into the joy of thy reward. He looks at the judges and says, I would encourage you to examine your life and make sure you are ready to hear such a remark. He says, I am done. And he goes and sits down. He won a unanimous decision from the U.S. Supreme Court for that. Well, John Quincy Adams is also the guy who leads the filibuster-ish movement to keep Texas from joining the Union, because Texas at the time was a pro-slavery state. He said, we don't need more slave states in America. We're trying to end slavery in America. So he leads this fight in Congress. Well, he keeps leading these fights to stop the slavery progress in America. Well, one of the things that we are still allowed to do is you can petition your congressman for a redress of grievances. And so what happened is they would have a certain day that congressmen could bring petitions from citizens. Well, because he was the anti-slavery guy, the anti-slavery people would send him all their petitions. So he would get up and he would present their petitions to end slavery in America. Now, he's also, in the midst of this, he's in a Congress that he says is about 80% pro-slavery. So they're not in favor of his petitions. Well, one day he got up with over 900 petitions to end slavery. And this is a pro-slavery Congress. And so they were tired. They don't want to deal with this. So they did what you can still do in Congress today. They sent a delegation down to the Rules Committee. And in the Rules Committee, you pass all the rules. So they passed a new rule which says you can present any petition you want except an anti-slavery petition. Well, he's not about to be slowed down in this. So he gets up and he says, well, we need to have a petition. I have a petition here for a new bridge and end slavery. And they go, oh, wait, no, you can't end slavery. And so they tried to censor him. They tried to expel him. They tried reprimand. They tried everything they could to get him out. Well, he doesn't stop. In fact, he was there for 17 years leading this fight before he ends up dying there. Well, as he's there, one day a reporter comes up to him. He's been there for years and years and years. And this reporter says, Mr. Adams, how are you able to maintain the vigor that you express in this fight when you've had no visible signs of success? Everybody here hates you, right? Nobody's on your side, and yet how are you able to do this? His response to the reporter, I think, is one of the most profound things that anybody's ever said. He said, well, the reason I'm able to keep fighting is very simple. He says it's because the duty is ours and the results are God's. He says, it's up to me to do the right thing. It's up to God what happens after that. It's not up to me what happens. It's just up to me to do the right thing. I leave the rest in God's hands. This is an absolutely amazing perspective, but this is a perspective of a guy who understood the significance and the role of faith in life. And let me give you another story real quick. So Daniel Webster is a guy kind of the same era as John Quincy Adams. He served in the House and Senate for 30 years, was considered the most famous orator, the greatest orator of American history. So people have heard the name Patrick Henry. Well, Daniel Webster was even better than Patrick Henry. This guy was phenomenal. Well, what's cool about this guy is his desk is still in use in the Senate today. And the reason we know his desk is still in use is because his name was carved in the bottom of his desk. And the reason he did that is back then, and really kind of 1800 all the way through about the 1870s, we had church every single Sunday in the Senate building, in the Congress, the House building. And so what they would do is they would come in and they'd move all the desks off to the side. They would have church and they'd bring them back. Well, Daniel Webster got tired of not getting his desk back. So he carved his name in the bottom. No, this one's mine. It's got my name on it. So he got his desk back. But what's cool about it is actually the story of how he got his penknife, which is just remarkable, but it goes back to when he was actually only a 6-year-old boy in a one-room schoolhouse. His teacher was Master Tappan, and Master Tappan tells a story. Back then, we had school Monday through Saturday, and actually, it was only 2 or 3 months a year, so it wasn't too bad. It was actually a pretty good deal. It was just when you weren't having planting and harvesting, and you weren't having to work on the farm, right? So these kids were in school Monday through Saturday. One Saturday, Master Tappan, he pulls out a little pocket knife. He says, the scholar who memorizes the most Bible verses by Monday will receive this penknife. So all the kids go home, they're working on memory, they're working on trying to get these Bible verses done. Well, on Monday, he lines all the students up. He says, and I started with the oldest, and he says the first student, maybe he had 12, and the next one had 14, the next one had 7, the next one had 6. He says, I worked my way all the way to the end to 6-year-old Daniel Webster. I said, Master Webster, have you memorized any verses? He said, yes, sir. I said, then you may begin. So Daniel quoted his first verse, and then his second verse, and then a third verse, and then a fourth and a fifth, and a sixth and a seventh, and an eighth and a ninth and a 10th. Master Tapman said, I stopped him somewhere between 60 and 70 verses. He's 6. I said, Daniel, do you have any more verses? To which Daniel replied, oh, yes, sir, I have several chapters left. All right, Daniel, you win the knife. Well, Daniel said, actually, and as he goes on to become an attorney, goes on to actually argue cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, a lot of cool things he does. Daniel Webster says that you could not be a good orator, you couldn't be a good attorney if you did not practice reading the Bible out loud. And the reason was, he says, really grammatically, whether it's your syntax and all these things, it's so good for you to do this, he says. But Daniel would practice reading the Bible out loud. Well, there are records where people would go to his office in Washington, D.C., and they would sit outside his office just to hear him practice reading the Bible. And they said that people said their 2 favorite things. Isaiah was one because of all the prophecies of Isaiah. The second one was the book of Job. They said because it sounded like there were a group of men having an argument in his office because he read every part in character. And they said it was amazing when God showed up, because the door would rattle on the hinges because his booming voice. Well, as he practiced this, as he would have cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, there were records of cases where other attorneys, when they found out they had to face Daniel Webster, they would drop the case rather than go up against him because they said, it's just a waste of time. This guy's going to win. He never loses. Well, one of the cases he won is this case. It's Vidal versus Girard's Executors. And in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that you could not be a public school in America if you did not promote Christianity, teach the Bible, and allow gospel ministers on campus to evangelize the students. They said if a public school does not want to do that, they should become a private school, because private schools can do whatever they want. But as long as you receive government funding, government assistance, you are required to promote Christianity, to teach the Bible, and to allow gospel ministers on campus to evangelize. Well, this was a case won by Daniel Webster. Now, that's a little different than today, right? But this is 1844, early America, and this is his decision where he's defending the use of the Christian faith in schools. Well, he wins this decision. What's remarkable about Daniel Webster, and there's many cases we could point to, many famous accolades from him, but one of the cool things about him is he was asked, how did you really accomplish so much in your life? How did you achieve all that you've achieved? Here's what he said about it. If there's anything in my thoughts or style to commend, the credit is due to my parents for instilling in me an early love of the Scriptures. If we abide by the principles taught in the Bible, our country will go on prospering and to prosper. But if we and our posterity neglect its instruction and authority, no man can tell how sudden a catastrophe may overwhelm us and bury all our glory in profound obscurity. If we ever get away from the Bible, we're just not going to make it. We're not going to be a good nation, he says. Well, he's exactly right. But again, this is where, if you start looking at early America, the leaders of early America were people influenced by the Bible, motivated by faith to do what they did. Let me jump forward. Let me give you one of my favorite examples as we finish right now. President Eisenhower, famous guy for lots of reasons, but especially when you look at what he accomplished in the war and all that he did, absolutely, he's a guy, Winston Churchill says that he's kind of the brainchild behind a lot of what we did, even when you look at D-Day and a lot of the invasion. And so Eisenhower's a really famous guy. Well, at the end of the war, he goes on and he ends up becoming president. As president, he's looking at the nation, and remember, he's been over in Europe. He's fought this war, this great war, World War II, and so he's seen a lot of things happening in Europe. He's fought against communism, fought against a lot of these things, and he says, as I'm looking at our nation, he says, I'm afraid that there's one thing in our nation's a problem. He says, our nation's becoming too secular. He says, we need to do something in our nation to make sure we don't become too secular. And he's writing this. He says, and I started thinking, he's getting ready to be sworn in. He said, I started thinking, what can we do? He says, well, I'm not a pastor, so I can't really preach a sermon. What can I do? He says, well, I'm a Christian. I could lead the nation in prayer. So at his inauguration, you actually can go on YouTube and you can find this clip. He actually,
my friends, before I begin the expression of those thoughts that I deem appropriate to this moment, would you permit me the privilege of uttering a little private prayer of my own? And I ask that you bow your heads.
All he led is actually this prayer right here. We actually own that original prayer at Wall Builders, one of the really cool things we own. But the reason I point this out is because you had a president who says, you know, our nation will not survive if we become a secular nation. And he had just fought a bunch of secular nations. He had fought against communism firsthand. He had been to those death camps, those concentration camps. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. And he says, America will not survive. We will not make it as a people if we become a secular people. He says, I want to do something to help point us back in the right direction. Well, another thing he did, he's the guy responsible for doing the National Prayer Breakfast, which every single year we're going to pray and remember God at his National Prayer Breakfast. He's also the guy who gets under God back in the pledge, or in the pledge for the first place. And actually, that's a pretty cool story. The Reverend George Doherty is a Scottish immigrant minister, comes to America, and one day he's asking his son. He says, hey, what was school like? And, oh, Dad, school. He says, well, no. We've only been here like 2 years. I don't know what you do in American schools. What do you do in school? And so his son says, well, we open with prayer. Then we say the Pledge of Allegiance. And his dad says, well, what's the Pledge of Allegiance? I've never heard that before. He says, well, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Not yet. And the Reverend Doherty, his dad, heard that and said, as I listened to this, it struck me, that could have been the pledge to a communist flag. There's nothing about that pledge that makes it uniquely American. He says what makes America unique and different is we are a nation under God. So the following Sunday, he delivers this sermon. This sermon is called Under God. And what he said is we have to make sure we remember what makes us as an American nation, Americans, and the fact that we are under God. We have to get back to being under God in what we do. Well, as he delivers a sermon, guess who's sitting on the front row listening? The President of the United States. So President Eisenhower on Monday calls this little meeting, says, hey guys, I've got this really good idea. We should put under God in the pledge. The congressman said, okay, well, yeah, let's do that. So they are the ones that go and they put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And it was done, by the way, because of a pastor saying we need to make sure we remember we are a nation under God. The Scottish immigrant got it right. Well, Eisenhower is also the guy who says, you know, we need a prayer chapel in the U.S. Capitol. So he takes and converts a room and makes it a prayer chapel. You see this image back here is George Washington kneeling in prayer. Psalm 16:1, preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust. He wanted to make sure that our congressmen, our senators, they could pray every time before they have to vote. They could seek God's voice, seek God's favor on what they're doing. But he says, we got to make sure we have a prayer chapel in the Capitol. Well, now we have a prayer chapel in the Capitol. In 1956, he's the one who said we need to put in God we trust on our currency. It was already on our coins. We want it on our currency. He's also the guy that said we need to make sure we do our national motto, in God we trust. We need to keep God the center of what we do in America. Now, he did an awful lot as president. But why did he do all this? Because what he said is, we are becoming too secular in America. He says, and our nation will not survive as a secular nation. And here's what's interesting to me. He understood something that previous generations, previous presidents long understood, what Psalms 33:12 tells us. Blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord. He wanted to make sure that we kept God at the center of our consciousness in America, because he knew the only way America will be blessed is if we have God at the center of what we do. And this is where, if we look at our nation today, we don't have the same conviction from many of our political leaders, from a lot of the leaders of our nation. They don't have these same thoughts of blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. But this is the foundation of what made our nation unique and different. It was this philosophy that made us an exceptional nation. It wasn't a unique American idea. It was a Bible idea. Because God's ways work, and God's ways only work every single time. They only work every time they're applied. And you know, God's ways work in our personal life. They work in our marriages. They work in our families. They work in our businesses, and they work in our nation. And we have a nation now who is embracing secularism. We're not really sure we want God in our nation. We're not sure we want God in government. And we're not sure we want God in politics, which is why we were talking to Andrew just a couple years ago, and we were talking about some of this need. He says, you know, we need to start a government training program here at Charis. We need people to come and know how to serve God in this other mountain, in this sphere of government, where we could have some people go, wait a second, no, we're not going to be a secular nation. We're going to get back to what God wants us to do and be. And this is where the challenge is for us. We have to get back to this thought. In fact, let me close with the Bible verse. Proverbs 14:34 tells us that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. One of the things that we are seeing very common now is a lot of people are kind of buying into this mantra, let's make America great again. Some people are going, America was never great. And there's this argument happening. But here's a fundamental principle you need to know. If you want America to ever be great, you're going to have to know what makes America great. And it's not a politician. It's not a political party. The Bible says it's righteousness. And this is why, as Christians, we have to engage in the process, because no secular heathen is ever going to promote righteousness. If we get righteousness in the land, it's because Christians are saying, you know what? We're going to stand up for righteousness. We're going to promote righteousness. We're going to elect leaders who believe in righteousness. This is where, as Christians, we have to get back to this idea, and this is a lot of what Andrew has believed in and wanted to do with this government school up here, is we want to get back to saying, hey, we need righteousness in our nation, not just because we want America to be blessed, but because we want America to do what God honors. And honestly, I mean, we can pray all day long, God bless America. It's real simple. When America does what God blesses, God will bless America. But the only way America will do what God blesses is when the people that live in America, once again, promote the things that God bless. And this is why we have to get involved in the process to promote righteousness in our land. Thank you guys so much.